The chain scraped across the asphalt, a harsh metallic scream under the blazing afternoon sun, and the German shepherd's body dragged inches from the ground, paws bleeding, eyes still watching, until a truck door slammed. Daniel Hayes stepped out, silent, his shadow stretching long, his gaze locking onto the scene like a switch flipping inside him. Let him go. No shouting. No warning. Just something colder. The laughter faltered. The air shifted. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The dog didn't bark, just tapped its tail once against the ground. And in that moment, something far deeper than anger woke up, something Daniel thought he'd buried years ago. Some sounds don't belong to the world. They belong to memories we try to forget. The noise came first, long before anyone saw the dog. A slow scraping echo rolling across the dry roadside like metal dragged over stone, steady, unnatural, out of place in the quiet stretch of highway where the air shimmered at 90 degrees and the wind carried the faint scent of dust and sunburnt grass. Then the shape appeared, low against the ground, moving but not by choice. A German shepherd with a coat dulled by dirt and exhaustion, his chest rising in shallow breaths, his amber eyes open but distant, not panicked, not wild, just watching as if he had already seen worse things than this. A loose chain trailed beside him, clinking softly, each link catching light like small fragments of something broken, and every few seconds the sound would shift, metal brushing asphalt, a rhythm that didn't match the world around it. Farther down the road, an old pickup slowed, tires crunching over gravel as it pulled to the shoulder, engine ticking as it cooled, the kind of vehicle that had seen too many miles and too many quiet drives with no destination. The door opened with a hollow creak, and Daniel Hayes stepped out, boots hitting the ground with a weight that seemed to settle the air itself. He didn't move right away. He stood there, one hand resting briefly on the door, eyes fixed ahead, taking in the scene without hurry, without reaction, the way someone does when they've learned that rushing never changes what's already happening. At 42, Daniel carried himself like a man who had spent years listening to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes after noise you can't forget. And though his face remained still, something in his gaze shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a line drawn quietly beneath everything he was seeing. The wind moved past him, lifting the edge of his worn flannel, carrying that same metallic scent closer now, sharper, familiar in a way he couldn't ignore, and somewhere beneath it all, beneath the heat and the dust and the distant hum of an empty road, there was another sound, softer, almost lost, the faint tap of a tail against the ground. Once, then again, not a signal of fear, not quite, but something else, something that waited. Daniel took a single step forward, then another, each one measured, deliberate, as if the distance between him and the dog held more than just space. And when the shepherd's eyes met his, there was no sudden movement, no attempt to pull away, only a quiet stillness, a recognition that passed between them without words. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath steady but heavy, and for a moment, just a moment, the road, the heat, the noise of the chain, all of it seemed to fall away, leaving only that look, that silent exchange that reached deeper than either of them expected. Somewhere in the back of his mind, something old stirred, not a memory fully formed, not yet, but a feeling, a pattern, a rhythm he had learned to notice long ago, the kind that meant something unseen was about to surface. And Daniel Hayes, who had spent years avoiding exactly that, realized he was already stepping toward it. Daniel did not reach for the chain right away because some things in life could not be rushed, not wounds, not trust, and certainly not moments that felt like they carried something deeper beneath the surface. So he slowed his steps even more, boots pressing into the gravel with a steady rhythm that matched his breathing, the heat pressing against his back, while the dry wind whispered across the open road, carrying that same faint metallic scent that now felt less like an accident and more like a memory trying to surface. The dog remained still, his body low but not collapsing, his chest rising in quiet effort, each breath measured, as if he had learned how to conserve strength in ways most creatures never needed to. And when Daniel came within a few feet, he lowered himself slightly, not fully kneeling, just enough to bring his presence closer without overwhelming, his movements controlled, intentional, the kind of calm that had been forged over years where sudden actions often led to consequences no one could take back. "Easy," he said softly, his voice low and even, not a command, not quite comfort, but something in between, something that offered space rather than demand. The German shepherd's ears flicked at the sound, not sharply, not with fear, but with recognition, as if the tone itself carried meaning beyond the words. And then, almost imperceptibly, the dog's tail tapped the ground again, once, then paused, then once more, a pattern that settled into the silence between them like a quiet signal waiting to be understood. Daniel noticed it immediately because he had spent years learning to notice the smallest details, the things others overlooked, the subtle shifts that told a larger story. And something about that rhythm stirred a memory he had not visited in a long time. Something tied to training, to communication that did not rely on speech, to moments where survival depended on reading what could not be said aloud. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave his shoulders as he extended one hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, not reaching to grab, only offering presence. And for a second, nothing happened except the wind brushing past them and the distant hum of a car miles away. Then the dog moved, not away, but forward, just enough that his nose hovered inches from Daniel's hand, the air between them shifting with a faint warmth. And when their distance closed, the shepherd did not flinch, did not pull back. He simply stayed, his eyes no longer distant but focused, steady, as if he had made a decision that did not need to be spoken. Daniel let his fingers rest lightly against the side of the dog's neck, careful, slow, feeling the coarse texture of fur warmed by the sun, and beneath it, the subtle tension of a body that had not yet decided if it was safe to relax. And he did not push further, because trust was not something taken, it was something earned in moments exactly like this. The chain lay beside them, quiet now, its earlier noise replaced by stillness, and Daniel glanced at it briefly, noting its weight, the way it had been worn. Smooth in places, the way it caught light unevenly, small details that told a story he did not need to fully understand to recognize that it did not belong here anymore. He reached for it slowly, lifting it just enough to remove the tension it carried, letting it fall gently to the ground without sound. And as it settled, the dog's breathing shifted, not dramatically, but enough that Daniel felt it beneath his hand, a slight release, a subtle easing that spoke louder than any movement could. The air around them seemed to change, the harsh edge of the moment softening into something quieter, something that allowed space for the next step, whatever that would be, and Daniel found himself studying the dog more closely now, taking in the lines of his face, the clarity in those amber eyes, the way they held awareness that felt older than the moment itself. There was intelligence there, but also something else, something that felt like memory, like recognition that went beyond instinct, and Daniel could not ignore the way it echoed inside him, the way it pulled at something he had spent years keeping buried beneath routine and distance. He shifted his weight slightly, lowering himself further until he was fully crouched, bringing himself level with the dog, and for a brief moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the road fading, the heat fading, everything else becoming background to the quiet exchange unfolding in that space. "You have been through something," Daniel murmured, not expecting an answer, not needing one, because some truths were evident in the way of being carried itself, in the way it held still instead of reacting, in the way it watched instead of panicked. The dog's ears tilted again, and this time, his head lowered just a fraction, not in submission, but in something closer to acknowledgement, and then, slowly, he shifted his weight, pushing himself up just enough to sit, the movement careful but deliberate, as if choosing to remain rather than leave. Daniel felt that choice, understood it in a way that did not require explanation, and something inside his chest tightened, not with pain, but with a recognition that felt almost unfamiliar after so long. He reached into his truck without breaking that quiet connection, retrieving a half-full canteen from the seat, the metal cool against his hand despite the heat outside, and when he returned, he unscrewed the cap slowly, pouring a small amount into the lid before setting it gently on the ground a few inches away. The dog watched the movement, then glanced back at Daniel, as if confirming something unspoken, before lowering his head and drinking in small, measured laps, not rushed, not desperate, just steady, controlled. the same way he had been breathing. Daniel sat back slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, watching without interruption, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. And as the dog finished and lifted his head again, there was a subtle shift in his posture, a faint straightening, a quiet presence returning where exhaustion had been. The tail tapped the ground once more, softer this time, and Daniel felt it again, that pattern, that signal, and this time it was clearer, not just a coincidence, not just a reflex, but something intentional, something that pointed beyond the present moment towards something waiting to be discovered. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a different scent now, faint but distinct, something cooler, something that did not belong to the open road but to a place nearby, unseen, and the dog's ears turned toward it instantly, his body still but alert in a way that did not feel like fear, more like recognition. Daniel followed that subtle shift, his gaze moving past the edge of the road toward a narrow stretch of land where dry grass met a line of scattered trees, their shadows stretching long across the ground. And for a moment, he hesitated, not because he doubted what he felt, but because he recognized it too well, that quiet pull towards something unknown that never arrived without reason. He looked back at the dog, and the dog looked at him, and in that silent exchange, there was an understanding that did not need words, a shared awareness that whatever came next was already in motion. And Daniel Hayes, who had spent years avoiding paths that led into uncertainty, realized he was about to follow one again. The dog did not move immediately, and that was the first thing Daniel noticed as the wind shifted again, brushing through the dry grass with a low whisper that carried something cooler beneath the heat, something that did not belong to the open stretch of highway, and yet the shepherd's attention had already locked onto it with a focus that felt precise, intentional, as if the world had quietly changed direction and only he had heard it. Daniel rose slowly from his crouch, his joints stiff but steady, eyes following the same line the dog had chosen, toward that narrow break in the landscape where the road gave way to scattered trees and uneven ground, a place easy to overlook if you were not looking for anything in particular. He brushed his hands lightly against his jeans, more out of habit than necessity, then glanced back at the chain lying silent on the gravel, its purpose already fading into something that no longer mattered. And for a moment he considered leaving it there, letting the road take it back into its own kind of forgetting, but something in him resisted that idea, something quiet but firm, so he reached down, lifted it carefully, and placed it in the back of his truck, not as a keepsake, not as a reminder, but simply because some things should not be left behind without being acknowledged. When he turned back, the dog was already standing, not fully upright, but enough that his posture carried intention, his weight balanced in a way that suggested readiness rather than uncertainty, and those amber eyes met Daniel's again, holding that same steady awareness that seemed to reach beyond the moment. "You are not done, are you?" Daniel said quietly, the words more observation than question, and the dog's ears tilted slightly forward, his head turning toward the trees once more before he took a single step in that direction, then paused, looking back as if waiting, not demanding, not urging, just offering a choice. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, not because anything was amusing, but because the situation felt familiar in a way he had not expected, like stepping into a pattern he had once known by instinct, something that required trust without explanation. He closed the truck door with a soft thud, the sound settling into the air behind him, and then he followed. The ground changed as they moved off the roadside, gravel giving way to packed dirt and brittle grass that crunched softly underfoot, the heat lingering but less oppressive beneath the thin shade of the scattered trees ahead, their branches stretching overhead in uneven patterns that filtered the sunlight into shifting bands of gold and shadow. The dog moved carefully, not rushing, his pace measured as if each step was chosen rather than taken, and Daniel matched it without thinking, his stride adjusting naturally, the rhythm between them forming without effort. The further they went, the more the noise of the road faded, replaced by quieter sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of something unseen, and beneath it all, a faint, irregular echo that Daniel could not immediately place, something subtle enough to be ignored by most, but not by him, not anymore. He slowed slightly, listening, letting his senses extend beyond what he could see, and the memory came back in fragments, not fully formed, but enough to recognize the pattern. The way sound traveled differently when it bounced off uneven surfaces, the way it carried through spaces hidden from view, and his gaze sharpened as he scanned the terrain ahead more closely. The dog stopped abruptly, his body still but alert, ears forward, tail low but steady, and for a moment neither of them moved, the air holding that same quiet tension that Daniel had felt before in places where something waited just out of sight. Then the shepherd stepped forward again, veering slightly to the left where the ground dipped almost imperceptibly, a shallow depression masked by overgrown grass and scattered brush, easy to miss unless you were looking at it from the right angle. Daniel followed, his boots pressing into softer earth now, and as he approached the edge of that dip, the sound became clearer, not loud, not alarming, but distinct enough to recognize, a faint metallic hum, irregular, almost like something shifting slowly beneath the surface. He stopped at the edge, his eyes tracing the outline of the ground, noting the subtle differences in color and texture, the way the grass grew unevenly, the way the soil seemed disturbed long ago and then left to settle, and a quiet realization formed in his mind, not fully understood, but enough to know that this place held something that had not yet finished revealing itself. The dog stepped down into the shallow depression, his movements careful but confident, and then he did something that made Daniel's chest tighten slightly. He tapped his tail against the ground again, once, then again, the same pattern as before, deliberate, intentional, as if marking the moment. Daniel crouched at the edge, studying the spot more closely now, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface of the soil, feeling the slight give beneath it, the subtle difference that confirmed what his instincts had already begun to tell him. And as he looked up, meeting the dog's gaze once more, there was no longer any question about what came next, only the quiet understanding that whatever they had found was not an accident, and that somehow, for reasons he could not yet explain, he had been meant to walk off that road and follow this exact path. Daniel did not reach for the ground immediately because the moment asked for something quieter than action, something closer to listening, and he had learned long ago that the difference between finding something and missing it often came down to patience. So he remained crouched at the edge of the shallow depression, his eyes tracing the uneven surface while the wind shifted above him, carrying that same faint metallic undertone that now felt anchored to this exact spot. The dog remained below, still but attentive, his body angled slightly toward the center of the dip as if guarding it, or perhaps guiding, and every few seconds his ears would flick in response to something Daniel could barely hear, something subtle enough to live just beneath awareness. Daniel placed his palm flat against the ground, pressing gently, feeling not just the surface but the resistance beneath it, the way the soil gave slightly, and then held, as if layered over something that did not belong to the natural pattern of the land. He closed his eyes for a brief second, not to rest, but to sharpen what he could not see, allowing the faint hum to come forward, irregular but present, a quiet vibration that seemed to pulse at uneven intervals, not mechanical, not entirely natural, something in between. When he opened his eyes again, his focus had shifted, no longer scanning broadly, but narrowing to a specific point just a few inches from where the dog stood, a patch where the grass grew thinner, where the color of the dirt held a slightly darker tone, as if disturbed and then left to settle years ago. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog, his voice low and steady, and he reached forward, brushing aside the brittle strands of grass with careful movements that disturbed as little as possible. The soil beneath was compact but not hardened, and as his fingers traced along its surface, they caught on something faintly ridged, something that did not belong to earth or stone, and he paused, his breath slowing as recognition settled in without needing a name. He shifted his position slightly, angling his body to get a better view, and then he began to clear the area more deliberately, not digging, not forcing, just revealing what was already there, layer by layer, until a thin edge appeared, dull and worn but unmistakably shaped by human hands. It was metal, aged and weathered, its surface marked by time and elements, but still intact, still holding its form beneath the years that had tried to erase it. The dog stepped closer, his nose hovering just above the exposed edge, but he did not touch it, did not interfere. He simply watched, his presence steady, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Daniel brushed more soil away, widening the exposed area until the outline began to take shape. Not large, not obvious, but defined enough to suggest intention, a panel or a cover, something placed here rather than lost, something meant to be hidden but not forgotten. The faint hum grew slightly clearer now, not louder, but more distinct, as if the act of uncovering had brought it closer to the surface, and Daniel felt it through his fingertips, a subtle vibration that traveled through the metal into his hand, not enough to alarm, but enough to confirm that whatever lay beneath was not entirely still. He sat back on his heels for a moment, considering, his mind moving through possibilities without settling on any single one, because this was not a situation that called for assumptions, only for awareness. The wind moved through the trees again, casting shifting shadows across the ground, and for a brief second, the light caught the metal at just the right angle, revealing faint markings etched into its surface, worn but visible enough to recognize as deliberate, not decorative, but functional, symbols or letters that had once held clear meaning. Daniel leaned closer, brushing away the remaining dirt from that section, his fingers moving carefully so as not to obscure what he was trying to see, and as the markings came into view, something in his expression tightened, not with fear, but with recognition that ran deeper than surface understanding. He did not speak, did not name what he saw, but the memory behind it stirred fully now, no longer fragments, but connected, a pattern he had seen before in places far removed from quiet roads and forgotten stretches of land. The dog shifted his weight slightly, his tail tapping the ground once more, softer this time, almost like an acknowledgement rather than a signal, and Daniel glanced at him briefly, their eyes meeting in that same quiet exchange that had followed them since the roadside. "You knew," Daniel said under his breath, not accusing, not surprised, just stating what had already become clear, and the dog's gaze held steady, offering no answer and needing none. Daniel returned his attention to the metal surface, tracing the edge until he found a narrow gap, a seam where it met the surrounding earth, and he paused again, considering the next step, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the unknown that lay beneath. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small folding tool, worn from use but reliable, and with careful precision, he inserted it into the seam, applying just enough pressure to test the resistance without forcing it open. The metal responded with a faint shift, subtle but definite, as if acknowledging his presence rather than resisting it, and Daniel stopped there, holding the position, listening, feeling, allowing the moment to settle before moving further. The hum beneath the surface seemed to align briefly with his own breath, not in rhythm, but in awareness, and for a fleeting second, the world around them felt suspended, as if the trees, the wind, even the distant road had stepped back to make space for whatever was about to unfold. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip steady, his mind clear, and he understood something then, not in words, but in certainty, that this was not just a discovery, not just an object buried and forgotten, but a continuation of something that had begun long before he stepped off that road, something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for someone willing to notice what others would pass by. And as he prepared to lift the edge just enough to reveal what lay beneath, he realized that whatever he found would not only answer a question, but ask one in return. Daniel did not force the panel open, not yet, because something in the subtle vibration beneath his hand suggested that this was not meant to be rushed, and he had learned long ago that the difference between control and chaos often came down to how a man handled the next inch, not the next mile. He eased the pressure slightly, allowing the metal to settle back into place, not closing it, not abandoning it, just acknowledging that whatever rested beneath had its own timing. And for a moment he simply stayed there, crouched at the edge of the shallow depression, one hand resting lightly on the worn surface, the other steady against his knee. The dog remained beside him, close enough that Daniel could feel the quiet presence of him without needing to look, a steady warmth in the shifting air, and when the wind moved again through the trees above, it carried a different sound now, softer, almost like a distant echo of something that had once been louder, something that had not entirely disappeared. Daniel tilted his head slightly, listening, and the faint hum beneath the ground seemed to respond, not in volume, but in clarity, as if the act of waiting had allowed it to become more defined, more intentional. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and then he did something that might have seemed insignificant to anyone watching, but to him it carried weight. He removed his hand from the tool, set it aside, and placed both palms flat against the metal surface, closing his eyes again, not to block out the world, but to feel it more fully. The vibration was still there, subtle but present, not mechanical in the way of engines or machinery, but patterned, almost like a pulse that had lost its rhythm and was trying to find it again, and beneath that, there was something else, something quieter, something that did not move at all but still made itself known. Daniel's brow tightened slightly as recognition edged closer, not a clear memory, not yet, but a sensation he had experienced before, somewhere far from this place, somewhere that had taught him to trust what could not be seen. The dog shifted beside him, not restlessly, not with urgency, but with purpose, stepping forward just enough that his front paw came to rest lightly on the edge of the panel, his weight balanced carefully as if he understood exactly where not to press. Daniel opened his eyes and glanced at him, and for a moment, the world narrowed again to that quiet exchange between them, a look that carried more understanding than words ever could. "All right," Daniel murmured, his voice low, steady, and this time when he reached for the edge of the panel, his movement carried a different kind of certainty, not rushed, not hesitant, but aligned with something that felt shared rather than decided alone. He slid the tip of his tool back into the narrow seam, adjusting the angle slightly, applying pressure not to force the metal open, but to guide it, to allow it to move the way it was meant to move. And after a brief resistance, there was a soft shift, a muted release that traveled through the surface and into his hands. The panel lifted just enough to break the seal it had held for years, perhaps longer, and with that small movement, the faint hum beneath changed again, not louder, but deeper, more grounded, as if it had been waiting for that exact point of contact. Daniel paused, holding the panel in that partially open position, allowing whatever lay beneath to settle into the new space created, and the air around them seemed to respond, the temperature shifting slightly, the scent of dry earth giving way to something cooler, something that carried a hint of mineral and stillness, like air that had not moved freely for a very long time. He lifted the panel a little more, slowly, carefully, until it opened enough to reveal a dark space beneath, not wide, not expansive, but deep enough that the light from above did not fully reach its bottom. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes adjusting as he tried to take in what he could, and for a moment, there was nothing but shadow, a quiet void that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Then, gradually, shapes began to form, subtle outlines that suggested structure rather than emptiness, surfaces that caught just enough light to hint at their presence without revealing everything at once. The dog lowered his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the opening, his ears forward, not in alarm, but in focused attention, and once again, his tail tapped lightly against the ground, a single, measured movement that seemed less like a signal and more like a confirmation. Daniel rested one hand on the edge of the opening, grounding himself as he leaned closer, and the faint hum now felt different, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but connected to what lay beneath, as if the source had been waiting just below the surface all along. He reached into his pocket again, retrieving a small flashlight, its surface worn from use but reliable, and when he switched it on, the beam cut through the shadow in a narrow line, revealing more of what had been hidden. The light fell across a surface below, not rough like natural earth, but shaped, defined, with edges that spoke of intention, of design, something placed there with purpose rather than left behind by chance. Daniel's breath slowed as he took it in, not reacting outwardly, not allowing surprise to take over, but internally, something shifted, something that recognized the significance of what he was seeing without needing it to be fully explained. The dog let out a soft exhale, barely audible, and Daniel glanced at him again, and in that shared moment, it became clear that whatever this was, whatever had been waiting beneath the ground all this time, it was not meant to be discovered alone. And as Daniel Hayes held the light steady, letting it reveal only what it was ready to show, he understood that this was no longer just about what had been found, but about what it would lead them to next. Daniel did not move the light too quickly because the first glimpse into an unknown space was never about seeing everything at once. It was about allowing the details to reveal themselves in their own time. So he held the beam steady, letting it rest along the edge of what lay beneath, watching how the light interacted with the surfaces below rather than forcing it deeper. The air rising from the opening felt cooler against his skin, carrying a stillness that contrasted sharply with the dry heat above. And there was a faint scent there, not unpleasant, but old, like stone that had not seen daylight in years, mixed with something metallic that lingered just beneath awareness. The dog remained at his side, his posture calm but alert, his breathing slow and even, and every now and then his ears would shift, slightly, tracking something that Daniel could not yet fully hear, as if the space below held more than just what the light could reach. Daniel adjusted his grip on the edge of the panel, lifting it a little higher, just enough to widen the opening without disturbing the balance of whatever rested beneath. And as the gap expanded, the light found more surfaces, revealing shapes that began to connect into something recognizable, not random, not natural, but structured, deliberate. There was a narrow descent just below the opening, not a steep drop, but a shallow incline formed by compacted earth and reinforced edges, as if someone had once intended for this space to be accessed with care, not abandoned entirely. Daniel leaned forward slightly, angling the flashlight downward, and the beam traced along that incline, catching on small details that confirmed what his instincts had already begun to understand. This was not a hole, not an accident, but an entry, something built, something placed with purpose and then left to rest beneath the surface of time. The faint hum continued, but now it felt less like a vibration and more like a presence, something that existed within the space rather than beneath it. And Daniel found himself listening more than looking, allowing the sound to guide his awareness in ways his eyes could not yet manage. He shifted his weight, sitting back just enough to take in the opening as a whole, measuring it, not with tools, but with experience, estimating depth, angle, stability, the quiet calculations that had once been second nature to him. And he realized that entering would not be difficult, but it would require intention, and more importantly, trust. The dog lowered his head closer to the edge, his nose hovering just above the opening. And then he did something subtle but unmistakable. He stepped forward, placing one paw carefully onto the compacted incline below, testing the surface before committing his weight, and when it held, he moved the rest of his body forward, descending a few inches into the space without hesitation. Daniel watched closely, noting the dog's movements, the way he adjusted to the terrain, the way his body remained balanced and controlled, and there was no sign of fear in him, no resistance, only a quiet readiness that spoke of certainty rather than curiosity. "You have done this before," Daniel said softly, not expecting an answer, but acknowledging the way the dog carried himself. And as he said it, something inside him settled, a recognition that whatever lay beneath was not entirely unknown to the one who had led him here. Daniel reached into the back of his truck once more, retrieving a pair of worn gloves, the leather softened from years of use but still reliable, and he slipped them on with slow, deliberate movements, not out of caution alone, but out of respect for the unknown surface he was about to touch. He returned to the edge, securing the panel in an open position so it would not shift unexpectedly, then placed one boot carefully onto the incline, testing it the same way the dog had, feeling for stability, for give, for any sign that the ground would not hold. It remained firm beneath him, and with a measured breath, he shifted his weight forward, lowering himself into the opening, one step at a time, his movements controlled, his balance steady. The temperature dropped slightly as he descended, the cooler air wrapping around him, carrying that same faint scent of stone and time. And as his boots reached the bottom of the incline, he straightened slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the reduced light while the beam from his flashlight filled in what the darkness concealed. The space was larger than it had first appeared, not expansive, but defined, enclosed by walls that bore the marks of intentional shaping, smooth in some places, rough in others, as if worked by hand and then left untouched for years. The dog stood a few feet ahead of him, waiting, not moving deeper, not rushing forward, simply holding his position as if marking the boundary between what had been revealed and what still remained hidden. Daniel stepped forward, his boots making a soft, muted sound against the compacted ground, and the hum seemed to shift again, not louder, but more aligned, as if his presence within the space had completed something that had been waiting. He raised the flashlight slightly, letting the beam sweep across the interior in a slow arc, revealing more of the structure, edges, surfaces, and then, just at the edge of the light, something that did not belong to the surrounding material, something distinct, something placed. Daniel paused, holding the beam steady on that point, his breath slowing as the outline began to form. And in that moment, standing beneath the surface of a place no one had noticed, he understood that whatever this was, it had not been left here by accident, and more importantly, it had not been waiting for just anyone to find it. Daniel did not step closer right away because the shape at the edge of the light demanded stillness more than movement, and he had learned long ago that the first seconds of discovery often held more truth than anything that followed. So he kept the beam steady, letting the outline sharpen on its own terms. The object rested partially embedded against the far wall, not buried, not hidden in the way the entrance had been, but placed with intention, as if it had been meant to be found only after the right path had been followed. It was rectangular, worn at the edges, its surface dulled by time, yet still holding a faint trace of structure that separated it from the surrounding stone. The dog remained just ahead of him, his body angled toward the object, his head slightly lowered, not in submission but in focus, and when Daniel took a slow step forward, the dog did not move aside. He simply shifted his weight enough to make space, as if acknowledging that this next part belonged to Daniel alone. The hum in the air changed again, not louder, not stronger, but closer, as if it had condensed around the space between them and that object, and Daniel felt it not just in his ears, but in his chest, a subtle resonance that aligned with something deeper than sound. He moved carefully, each step measured, the beam of his flashlight gliding across the ground before rising again to settle on the object, revealing more detail with each inch gained. The surface was not smooth, not polished, but marked, faint lines etched into it in patterns that suggested purpose rather than decoration, lines that intersected at deliberate angles, forming shapes that felt familiar without immediately offering their meaning. Daniel slowed again, stopping just a few feet away, allowing the distance to remain, and for a moment he simply stood there, taking it in, not analyzing, not forcing recognition, but letting it come naturally if it chose to. The dog's tail tapped once against the ground behind him, a soft, measured sound that seemed to echo slightly within the enclosed space, and Daniel felt that signal the same way he had before, not as a command, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had arrived. He lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the compacted ground, bringing his perspective closer to the object, and as he did, the beam of light shifted, catching on a section of the surface that had been shadowed before, revealing something that caused his breath to pause, not in shock, but in recognition that reached deeper than sight. There, along the upper edge, worn but still visible, were markings, not random, not abstract, but deliberate, structured, and though time had softened their clarity, their form remained intact enough to be understood by someone who had seen them before. Daniel's expression did not change outwardly, but something inside him settled into place, a quiet alignment between past and present that did not require explanation. He reached out slowly, his gloved hand hovering just above the surface before making contact, and when his fingers touched it, the hum shifted again, not in sound, but in sensation, a subtle vibration that traveled through the material into his hand, steady but gentle, like something acknowledging his presence rather than reacting to it. He did not pull back. Instead, he let his hand rest there, allowing that connection to hold for a moment longer. And in that stillness, the space around him seemed to quiet even further, the faint sounds of the world above fading until there was nothing but the soft rhythm of his own breathing and the barely perceptible pulse beneath his fingertips. The dog stepped closer now, coming to stand beside him, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's arm, not seeking comfort, but offering presence, grounding the moment in something real, something shared. Daniel glanced at him briefly, and in that glance there was an understanding that did not need words, that whatever this object was, whatever it held or represented, it had drawn both of them here for a reason that extended beyond chance. He returned his focus to the surface, tracing the markings with his eyes, not touching them directly, but following their pattern, their flow, and as he did, something began to form in his mind, not a full memory, but a direction, a sense of where these lines might lead if allowed to continue beyond what was visible. He shifted his hand slightly, feeling along the edge of the object, and there, near one corner, his fingers caught on something subtle, a difference in texture, a slight indentation that did not match the rest of the surface. He paused again, his breath steady, his mind clear, and then, with careful precision, he adjusted his grip, pressing lightly against that point, not forcing, not pushing, just testing, the same way he had approached everything since stepping off the road. For a second, nothing happened, and then, almost imperceptibly, there was a response, a faint shift within the object itself, not opening, not moving outwardly, but changing, as if something inside had acknowledged the contact. The hum deepened slightly, still quiet, still controlled, but unmistakably different now, and Daniel felt it resonate through his hand, through his arm, settling somewhere just beneath his ribs. He did not speak, did not react outwardly, but inside, he understood that this was no longer just a discovery, it was an interaction, a moment where something long silent had begun to respond. The dog's tail tapped once more, softer than before, and Daniel allowed himself a single slow breath, steady and calm, as he realized that whatever came next would not simply be revealed, it would be answered. Daniel did not increase the pressure on the indentation because whatever responded beneath his hand did not feel like something that needed force, it felt like something that required alignment, and that difference mattered more than anything he had learned through years of training. So he eased his fingers slightly, maintaining contact without pushing further, allowing the moment to breathe instead of breaking it. The faint vibration beneath the surface steadied, no longer shifting unpredictably, but settling into a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost as if it had adjusted to him, to his presence, to the way he had chosen to approach it. He kept his gaze fixed on the object, but his awareness extended beyond it now, taking in the space around him, the way the air held still, the way even the smallest sound seemed to echo with greater clarity, as if the environment itself had narrowed its focus to this exact point. The dog remained close, his shoulder still lightly brushing Daniel's arm, his breathing calm, his posture grounded, and then, without warning but without urgency, he lowered his head and touched his nose gently against the edge of the object, not pressing, not testing, just making contact the same way Daniel had. The reaction was immediate, though subtle, a shift in the vibration that deepened into something more cohesive, less scattered, and Daniel felt it travel through his hand more clearly now, a steady pulse that seemed to carry intention rather than randomness. He turned his head slightly toward the dog, and for a brief moment their eyes met. And in that look there was something unmistakable, not instruction, not command, but agreement, a shared understanding that whatever this was, it responded not to force, but to presence, to connection, to something that could not be measured or explained in simple terms. Daniel returned his attention to the object, adjusting his position so that he was more stable, his knee firmly planted, his balance centered, and then he moved his hand slowly along the surface, not searching blindly, but following the faint pattern of the etched lines he had noticed before, allowing his fingers to trace their path without pressing too hard. The lines felt different beneath the glove, not raised, not deeply carved, but defined enough that they guided his movement, leading him from one point to another in a sequence that felt intentional, almost like a map designed to be followed by touch rather than sight. He moved carefully, his breathing steady, his focus narrowing further with each inch, and as his fingers reached another intersection in the pattern, he paused, feeling for that same subtle difference in texture he had encountered before. The dog shifted slightly beside him, his tail tapping once against the ground, a soft, measured sound that seemed to mark the moment, and Daniel understood it without needing to think. He pressed lightly at that point, not forcing, just acknowledging it, and this time the response was clearer, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. The object beneath his hand seemed to release something, not opening fully, not revealing everything at once, but easing, as if a lock had been disengaged without the noise or resistance one might expect. The hum deepened again, not louder, but fuller, and for a brief second, the air itself seemed to carry that same subtle resonance, as if the space around them had shifted in response. Daniel held his position, not rushing to open or move anything further, allowing the change to settle. And as he did, he noticed something new, something that had not been visible before, a faint line along the edge of the object. Not a crack, not damage, but a seam that had blended so seamlessly with the surface that it had remained hidden until now. He angled the flashlight slightly, letting the beam fall across that line, and as the light caught it, the seam became clearer, its edges defined by the slightest difference in reflection, enough to reveal its purpose without fully exposing its function. The dog leaned forward again, his gaze fixed on that seam, his ears forward, his body still, and Daniel felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. Not excitement, not urgency, but something steadier, something that told him he was exactly where he was meant to be. He shifted his hand to the edge, placing his fingers along the seam, testing it the same way he had tested everything so far, with patience, with control, with an awareness that whatever lay beneath was not something to be taken, but something to be approached with respect. He applied a slight lift, not enough to force, just enough to see if the object would respond, and after a moment, there was a subtle movement, a gentle separation along the seam that widened just enough to confirm what he had already begun to understand. This was not just an object. It was a container, something meant to hold, something meant to protect what was inside. Daniel paused again, his hand still on the edge, his breathing steady, his mind clear, and for a moment he did not open it further. He simply remained there, aware of the weight of the moment, aware that once he moved beyond this point, there would be no returning to not knowing. The dog's tail tapped once more, softer now, almost like a reassurance rather than a signal, and Daniel glanced at him again. And in that brief exchange, there was no hesitation left, only a shared understanding that whatever waited inside had already chosen this moment to be revealed. Daniel Hayes took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and with the same careful precision that had brought him this far, he began to lift the seam just enough to let the first hint of what lay beneath meet the light. Daniel did not lift the seam all at once because the moment demanded something slower, something deliberate, and he had come too far guided by patience to abandon it now. So he raised the edge just enough for the light to slip inside, a narrow beam cutting through the darkness beneath, revealing only fragments at first, edges, surfaces, shapes that did not yet form a complete picture. The air shifted immediately, a cooler breath rising from within the container, carrying a scent that felt older than the space itself, something preserved, something untouched by time in a way that did not seem entirely natural. Daniel held his position, steady, allowing his eyes to adjust to what the light revealed, and slowly, the fragments began to connect. Inside, there was no chaos, no random collection of objects, but order, intentional and precise, as if everything had been placed with care, with purpose that extended beyond simple storage. A narrow compartment lined the interior, its surface smooth compared to the roughness of the surrounding chamber, and within it rested something wrapped, not loosely, not carelessly, but secured in a material that had aged yet held together, its texture catching the light in a muted, almost fabric-like sheen. Daniel's breath slowed further as he studied it, not reaching in yet, not disturbing the arrangement, because something in the way it had been placed suggested that this was not something meant to be handled without understanding. The dog leaned closer beside him, his head lowering toward the opening, his nose hovering just above the edge of the container. And then, as before, he did not rush, he did not push forward. He simply stayed there, present, aware, as if confirming what Daniel already felt, that this moment carried weight beyond the physical act of uncovering. Daniel shifted slightly, angling the flashlight deeper, and the beam revealed more, faint markings along the inner surface of the container, not etched roughly like the exterior lines, but finer, more deliberate, symbols or letters that seemed to follow a sequence, guiding the eye rather than confusing it. He narrowed his gaze, focusing on those markings, and something stirred again in his memory, not fully formed, but closer now, like a word on the edge of recall, a pattern that had meaning once and was beginning to return. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and then, with careful precision, He extended his hand toward the wrapped object, not to grab, not to take, but to feel, to understand its presence before moving it. His fingers brushed lightly against the surface, and the sensation was unexpected, not cold like the surrounding metal, not warm either, but balanced, as if it held its own temperature independent of the environment. The faint vibration shifted again, not stronger, but more focused, traveling through the object and into his hand, and Daniel felt it settle into a steady rhythm that aligned with something deeper than thought. He paused, allowing that connection to hold, and in that stillness, the world above seemed impossibly distant. The road, the heat, the open sky, all of it reduced to memory while this moment took precedence. The dog's tail tapped once against the ground behind him, softer than before, and Daniel understood it not as a signal to act, but as a confirmation that he was exactly where he needed to be. He adjusted his grip slightly, sliding his fingers beneath the edge of the wrapping, and with a slow, controlled movement, he lifted just enough to loosen it, not removing it completely, just revealing a small portion of what lay beneath. The light caught the exposed surface, and for a moment, Daniel did not move at all, his gaze fixed, his breath steady, because what he saw did not demand reaction, it demanded recognition. The material beneath the wrapping was different, smoother, marked with lines that mirrored the patterns on the container itself, but clearer, more defined, as if preserved in a way the exterior had not been. He traced one of those lines with his eyes, following its path, and as he did, the memory came into focus, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet certainty, a connection between what he had known and what now lay before him. Daniel did not speak, did not name it, but the understanding settled into him fully, and with it came a shift, not of fear, not of excitement, but of purpose, a recognition that this discovery was not random, not accidental, but part of something larger, something that had been waiting for this exact moment, for this exact sequence of events to unfold. The dog stepped closer, his shoulder pressing lightly against Daniel's arm, grounding him once again, and Daniel let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, his focus returning to the object, to the way it rested within the container, to the way it seemed both still and alive in a way he could not yet explain. He lowered the wrapping slightly, not closing it, not hiding it, but allowing it to rest as it had before, acknowledging that whatever this was, it would not reveal itself all at once. Daniel Hayes remained there for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the container, his mind clear, his senses sharpened, and as the faint hum settled into a quiet, steady presence, he understood that this was not the end of a discovery, but the beginning of something that would ask more of him than he had expected when he first stepped off that road. Daniel did not remove his hand from the container immediately because the quiet connection he had felt still lingered, not as a sensation he could fully describe, but as something steady, something that held his attention without demanding it. And for a moment he remained exactly where he was, kneeling in the dim light beneath the surface, allowing the weight of what he had just recognized to settle into something he could carry without losing clarity. The air in the chamber felt different now, not just cooler, but calmer, as if whatever presence had been waiting beneath the ground had shifted from observation to acceptance, and Daniel found himself breathing more evenly, the tension that had followed him down from the road easing into something quieter, something that felt almost like familiarity. The dog remained close, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and when Daniel finally leaned back slightly, withdrawing his hand from the container, the dog moved with him, not leading, not pulling ahead, but staying aligned, as if whatever came next was meant to be taken together. Daniel rested his forearms briefly against his knees, lowering the flashlight just enough to let the beam soften across the chamber, and as the light shifted, more of the space revealed itself, subtle details emerging from shadow, the contours of the walls, the way they curved slightly rather than forming sharp corners, the way the surface bore marks of careful shaping rather than rough excavation. This was not a place built in haste, and it was not abandoned in carelessness. It carried intention in every inch, a quiet purpose that had endured long after whoever placed it here had stepped away. Daniel lifted the light again, scanning slowly, allowing his eyes to follow the lines of the chamber beyond the container. And there, along the far wall, just beyond the reach of the first beam, something else began to take shape, something that had not been visible from above, something that seemed connected to what he had already found. He stood carefully, his movements controlled, his balance steady on the compacted ground, and as he took a step forward, the faint hum shifted again, not stronger, but broader, as if the space itself had expanded to include this next point of focus. The dog moved ahead this time, just a few steps, his body low but confident, his ears forward, and then he stopped, standing near the far wall, his gaze fixed on a section that at first appeared no different than the rest, until the light reached it fully. Daniel approached slowly, his flashlight rising to meet the surface, and as the beam settled, the difference became clear, not in shape, but in detail. The texture there was smoother, more refined, and faint lines traced across it in patterns that mirrored those on the container, but extended further, continuing beyond a single object into something larger, something that connected the space itself. He reached out again, his gloved hand brushing lightly against the wall, feeling the subtle grooves beneath the surface, following their direction, and as he did, the memory that had been forming since he first touched the object came into clearer focus, not as a single image, but as a series of impressions, fragments of training, of places, of moments where patterns like these had not been decoration, but communication, systems designed to guide, to signal, to protect. Daniel's expression remained steady, but his focus sharpened, and he began to trace the lines more deliberately, moving his hand along their path, following where they led rather than trying to interpret them all at once. The dog watched closely, his body still, his attention fixed on Daniel's movement, and then, as Daniel's hand reached a point where several lines converged, the dog's tail tapped lightly against the ground again, once, then paused, then once more, the same pattern, the same quiet confirmation that had guided him since the beginning. Daniel paused at that intersection, his fingers resting lightly against the surface, and he felt it again, that subtle shift, not a vibration this time, but a release, as if the space itself had acknowledged the sequence, the path he had followed. The air seemed to settle even further, the faint hum smoothing into something almost unnoticeable, and for a moment, everything felt still in a way that did not feel empty, but complete. He leaned closer, angling the flashlight to better illuminate the intersection, and there, just beneath the surface, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was another seam, not as defined as the one on the container, but present, a continuation of the same design, suggesting that what he had opened before was only part of a larger system, something that extended beyond a single discovery. Daniel did not act on it immediately. Instead, he stood there, his hand resting against the wall, his mind clear, his breathing steady, and he allowed the understanding to settle, that this was not simply about uncovering what had been hidden, but about following something that had been left behind with intention, something that required not just action, but awareness. The dog stepped closer again, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg this time, grounding him in the present, and Daniel glanced down at him briefly, the faintest shift in his expression suggesting something that had not been there before, not relief, not certainty, but something quieter, something like recognition of a path that had already begun. He turned his attention back to the wall, to the lines, to the seam that waited just beneath the surface, and as he stood there in the dim, cool space beneath the earth, Daniel Hayes understood that whatever this place was, whatever it held, it was not finished revealing itself, and neither was he finished following it. Daniel did not move his hand away from the wall because the faint seam beneath his fingers felt less like an object and more like a continuation of something he had already begun to understand. And for a moment he remained still, allowing his awareness to settle fully into that point of contact. The lines carved into the surface seemed quieter now, no longer drawing his attention outward, but guiding it inward, toward a single place where everything converged. He adjusted his stance slightly, grounding his weight more evenly, his boots pressing into the compacted floor as he leaned closer. His flashlight angled to hold the seam in a steady beam of light. The air in the chamber carried a subtle stillness that felt almost intentional, as if the space itself was waiting, not for action, but for recognition. The dog remained beside him, his posture calm, his presence steady, and then, without sound, he lowered himself into a resting position, his body relaxed but alert, as if signaling that whatever came next did not require urgency, only presence. Daniel noticed that shift immediately, and it settled something inside him, a quiet reminder that not every moment demanded movement. Some required stillness first. He drew a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and then he traced the seam again with his fingers, not searching for a latch, not forcing a mechanism, but following the same principle that had guided him from the beginning, understanding before action. The surface felt consistent except at one point, a subtle change in resistance, almost imperceptible unless you were paying close attention, and Daniel paused there, his fingertips resting lightly against that exact spot. He did not press immediately. Instead, he observed, letting his senses align, listening not just with his ears, but with the quiet awareness that had brought him this far. The faint hum that had once filled the space had softened into something barely noticeable, and in its place, there was a new sensation, not vibration, not sound, but presence, something that existed without announcing itself. Daniel glanced briefly at the dog, and the dog's eyes met his with the same calm certainty they had carried since the roadside, and in that moment, there was no hesitation left, only understanding. He returned his focus to the seam and applied the slightest pressure, not pushing, not forcing, just acknowledging the point where the pattern converged. For a second, nothing changed, and then, almost without movement, the surface beneath his hand shifted, not outward, not dramatically, but inward, as if something had released from within rather than opened from without. Daniel held his position, steady, allowing the change to complete itself, and then he felt it, a gentle separation along the seam, a quiet unlocking that carried no sound but held undeniable presence. He eased his fingers along the edge, and this time, when he lifted, the surface responded smoothly, without resistance, revealing a narrow opening that extended along the lines he had followed. The flashlight beam caught the interior as it was revealed, and what lay behind the wall was not another empty space, but a continuation of the same careful design, a recessed section that held something placed with the same precision as the container before. Daniel leaned closer, his breath steady, his movements controlled, and as the light settled, the shape within became clear, not large, not overwhelming, but significant in a way that did not need size to carry weight. It was an object, long and narrow, resting securely within the recessed space, its surface marked with the same patterns, but more refined, more complete, as if it represented the continuation of what he had already uncovered. The dog rose slowly and stepped closer, his head lowering slightly as he observed the newly revealed space. His tail still, his body calm, and once again, he did not rush forward, he did not interfere, he simply remained present, as if honoring the moment in the same quiet way Daniel did. Daniel extended his hand again, this time toward the object within the wall, his fingers hovering just above it before making contact, and as they did, the sensation returned, that same steady presence, but clearer now, more defined, as if the connection had deepened with each step he had taken. He did not remove the object, not yet. Instead, he allowed his hand to rest there, feeling the subtle texture beneath the glove, the faint lines that guided his touch, and as he traced them, the pattern began to make sense in a way it had not before, not as something to decode, but as something to follow, a path that extended beyond this chamber, beyond this moment. Daniel's gaze softened slightly, not in confusion, but in clarity, and for the first time since he had stepped off the road, there was a quiet understanding that what he had found was not just something left behind, but something left for someone, something that required not just discovery, but continuation. He withdrew his hand slowly, not breaking the connection, but acknowledging it, and as he did, the space around him seemed to settle even further, the stillness deepening into something that felt almost complete. The dog stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him once again in the present, and Daniel placed a brief, steady hand on the dog's back, not as reassurance, but as recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the role the animal had played in bringing him here. He looked once more at the object within the wall, at the lines that continued beyond it, and then at the chamber itself, and he understood that this was no longer about uncovering something hidden, it was about choosing whether to follow what had been revealed. And as Daniel Hayes stood there in the quiet, cool space beneath the earth. He realized that whatever path lay ahead had already begun the moment he chose to notice what others had ignored. Daniel did not reach for the object inside the wall immediately because something in the stillness around him had changed, not in a way that demanded hesitation, but in a way that asked for awareness. And he had learned long ago that when a moment felt complete, the next step was not to rush forward, but to understand what had already been given. He let his hand rest briefly against the edge of the recessed space. His fingers relaxed, no longer searching, no longer testing, just present. And as he stood there, the faint hum that had once guided him had nearly disappeared, replaced by a quiet that felt deeper than silence, a kind of stillness that carried resolution rather than emptiness. The dog remained beside him, his posture calm, his breathing steady, and when Daniel glanced down, the animal's eyes met his with the same quiet certainty that had followed them from the beginning. But now there was something softer in it, not urgency, not guidance, but completion, as if whatever had needed to be shown had already been revealed. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing as a subtle shift moved through him, not relief in the way of something ending, but clarity in the way of something understood. He turned his attention back to the object within the wall, studying it once more, not with the intensity of discovery, but with the steadiness of recognition, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to take it, to remove it from where it had been placed. Instead, he understood that its purpose had already been fulfilled, not by being claimed, but by being found, by being seen, by being acknowledged in the way it had been intended. He lowered his hand slowly, letting it fall to his side, and stepped back just enough to take in the space as a whole, the container, the wall, the patterns that connected them, all of it forming something larger than any single piece. The chamber no longer felt like a hidden place. It felt like a completed one, as if the act of following the path had brought it back into balance. The dog shifted slightly, stepping away from the wall and turning toward the incline they had descended, his movement unhurried, his posture relaxed, and when he paused at the base of the slope, he looked back once, not to call Daniel forward, but simply to acknowledge that the direction had changed. Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly, not because the dog required it, but because the moment felt shared, and he followed, his steps steady as he moved away from the wall, away from the object that remained exactly where it belonged. As he reached the incline, he paused briefly, turning his head to look back one last time, his gaze moving across the chamber, the patterns, the spaces that had revealed themselves piece by piece. And in that final glance, there was no question left, no uncertainty about what he had found or what it meant. He placed his foot on the slope and began to ascend, his movements controlled, his balance sure, and as he climbed, the air grew warmer again, the faint scent of dry earth returning, the quiet hum fading completely into memory. The dog moved ahead of him this time, reaching the top first, his silhouette outlined against the brighter light above, and when Daniel emerged from the opening, the contrast was immediate, the heat of the day pressing against him, the sound of the wind returning, the open sky stretching wide and uninterrupted. He stepped clear of the opening and turned, lowering the panel carefully back into place, not sealing it away, not hiding it, but allowing it to rest as it had before, part of the land, part of something that did not need to be disturbed again. The metal settled with a soft, final stillness, blending once more into the surface as if it had never been opened, and Daniel stood there for a moment, his hand resting lightly against it, not to reopen it, but to acknowledge it one last time. The dog came to stand beside him, his body close, his presence steady, and when Daniel looked down, there was a quiet understanding between them that did not need to be spoken, that whatever had been waiting beneath the ground had found what it needed in this moment. Daniel straightened slowly, his gaze lifting toward the horizon, the road stretching out in the distance, unchanged and yet somehow different now, not because it had moved, but because he had. He walked back to the truck in silence, his steps unhurried, his mind clear, and when he reached the driver's side, he paused, his hand resting on the door, the same position he had held when he first arrived, but the weight behind it no longer the same. The dog climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation, settling in with a quiet ease that mirrored Daniel's own, and when Daniel finally got behind the wheel, he did not start the engine right away. He sat there for a moment, looking out through the windshield at the road ahead, the heat shimmering in the distance, the world exactly as it had been, and yet not. Then, with a slow, steady motion, he turned the key, the engine coming to life with a familiar hum, and as the truck pulled back onto the road, there was no rush, no urgency to reach any particular place, only a quiet understanding that sometimes, the things we are meant to find are not meant to be taken with us, but to change the way we move forward. And as Daniel Hayes drove on, the dog beside him calm and watchful, the silence between them no longer empty, but full, he realized that what had been uncovered beneath the earth had not given him something to carry, but something to leave behind, something that had already begun to make its way into every mile that lay ahead. The road stretched forward in long, quiet miles, the kind that did not rush a man, but gave him space to notice what he had carried for too long. And Daniel Hayes drove without thinking about where he was going, only that he was moving, steady, present, no longer avoiding the silence that once followed him like a shadow. The truck hummed beneath his hands, the familiar vibration grounding him in something real, something simple, and beside him, the German shepherd rested with his head near the window, ears shifting occasionally at sounds only he could fully track, his breathing slow and even, no longer strained, no longer guarded. The afternoon light softened as the sun moved lower, casting long lines across the asphalt, and the wind that slipped through the cracked window carried the scent of dry fields and distant trees, the kind of air that reminded a man he was still part of something larger than whatever he had left behind. Daniel adjusted his grip on the wheel slightly, his eyes steady on the road ahead, and for the first time in a long while, there was no pressure in his chest, no quiet tension waiting beneath each breath, only a calm that did not ask anything from him. The dog shifted slightly, lifting his head just enough to look toward Daniel, and for a moment their eyes met, and in that brief exchange there was no need for explanation, no need for commands, only a shared understanding that whatever had been unsettled before had found its place. Daniel gave a small nod, almost instinctive, and returned his gaze forward, the road unfolding in front of him without urgency. A few miles passed before he slowed, the truck easing onto the shoulder near a wide overlook where the land opened into rolling hills, the kind of place where the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, untouched and quiet. He turned off the engine, and the sudden absence of its sound did not feel empty. It felt complete, like the final note of something that had already been played. He stepped out, boots meeting the warm gravel, and the dog followed, moving beside him with a calm confidence that had not been there before. They walked a short distance from the truck, stopping near the edge where the land dropped gently away, and Daniel rested his hands loosely at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his posture no longer carrying the weight it once had. The wind moved across the hills, brushing through the grass in soft waves, and for a moment, Daniel closed his eyes, not to escape anything, but to feel it fully, the air, the quiet, the absence of whatever had once followed him. The dog stood close, his body still, his presence steady, and then, without sound, he sat down beside Daniel, his gaze fixed on the distance as if he understood that this moment did not need movement, only stillness. Daniel opened his eyes slowly, taking in the view, the light, the open space that did not press against him but welcomed him without demand, and he let out a breath that felt different from all the others before it, not heavier, not lighter, just honest. He glanced down at the dog, his expression softening in a way that had not happened in years, and he reached out, resting his hand briefly against the dog's back. A simple contact, steady, real. The dog leaned into it just slightly, not seeking comfort, but acknowledging it, and then he lifted his head again, ears turning toward the distant sound of wind moving through the hills. Daniel straightened, his gaze returning to the horizon, and in that moment, there was no question about what came next, no uncertainty about the road ahead, because for the first time, he did not feel like he needed to find something else. He had already found what mattered, not beneath the ground, not inside the chamber, but in the way he now stood here, present, steady, no longer carrying what he had once believed he could not leave behind. The sun dipped lower, the light shifting into a softer tone that stretched across the landscape, and Daniel turned back toward the truck, not in a hurry, not with hesitation, just moving forward the way he had always been meant to. The dog followed without command, without leash, his steps matching Daniel's naturally. And when they reached the truck, Daniel paused for a moment, his hand resting on the door, the same place where everything had begun, and he allowed himself one last glance at the open land behind him. Then he opened the door, climbed inside, and as the engine started once more, the sound did not break the silence, it carried it forward. The road welcomed them again, stretching into the distance, and this time, Daniel Hayes did not drive to escape anything. He drove because he was ready to keep going, and beside him, the dog watched the horizon with the quiet certainty of something that had already found its place. And somewhere beyond the miles ahead, beyond the turns and the unknown stretches of road, there was a future that no longer felt like something to chase, but something that would arrive exactly when it was meant to. The same way everything else had, quietly, patiently, for those willing to notice.